Hello everyone, and welcome back to Storytime with Lady Anna. Reading from the book Dragonmede by Rona Randall. Quite good so far. And when we last left them, let's see. Luella, as she now insisted upon my calling her, a practice considered by the conventionally minded as being overly familiar and disrespectful between mother and daughter, would still never allow me to enter the card room, and even tried to keep me away from the drawing room, unless she considered her visitors respectable enough to meet me. Between my home and Joseph Whitehead's studio, my life took on a strange pattern, for in neither did I totally fit. At Bedlington, I had acquired certain standards my fellow art students viewed with some amusement, but when they were verging on the bohemian, I invited them to my home. Luella regarded them with undisguised distaste. This was not what she wanted for me. Friendship with impecunious students offered no hope of the successful marriage that she did so passionately desire for me. On the other hand, neither did my home life, for this raffish establishment was the last place in which I was likely to find the kind of husband she had her heart set upon for me. As my 20th birthday loomed, I knew Luella was caught in a web of anxiety, torn between conflicting moods of remorse, thwarted ambition, and optimism. After all, 20 wasn't all that old, although marriage no later than 18 was the expected thing. But after her careful planning, all that seemed likely to be my fate was some dull occupation as a teacher of a drawing or a lifelike of her own, which was the last she desired for me and the last I desired for myself. It was impossible not to see the effect this life had upon her, the imprint it had left. The tight lines of anxiety about a mouth once soft and lovely, the reckless despair which she grew less able to hide. She seemed to trust no man now, only her skill at cards. She'd played longer, and I sensed more recklessly, more desperately. Her slimness changed to thinness. She coughed a lot and grew impatient when old Bella chuckled over her like a mother hen. She also grew impatient with me. What is to become of you, Stacy, if you don't marry soon and marry well? What about Clarissa Mannering's brother? He was interested in you. You admitted this yourself. And when you returned from a visit there, you also admitted that you found him attractive. I was a schoolgirl, Mama, and he a student at Cambridge. You are not a schoolgirl now, and he will no longer be at Cambridge. And for goodness sake, don't call me Mama. From a young woman of your age, it makes me feel old. Write to Clarissa. Say you long to get out of London for a while. That will surely bring an invitation. And take Michelle with you. You know well enough that a French maid always creates a good impression. No, Luella. And why not, pray? I won't run after people. Well, you may be sure they won't run after you, no matter how lovely, and you are lovely, is Eustacia. A girl in your position is never pursued. I won't cultivate people just because they might be useful, I insisted stubbornly. In heaven's name, why not? How else do you think I have filled the card room all these years? This attitude of yours will never get you a husband, and wasting your time with those art students won't either. They are penniless for the most part, and artists remain so until after they are dead. As for meeting the right type of man here, my love, even I have to admit there is no hope of that. Which shows how wrong she was, for within a few days Julian Kershaw walked into our house and into my life. He was standing with his back to the drawing-room fire, a tall, blond young man of striking good looks, and I felt a total lack of conceit. His handsomeness sat as naturally upon him as the well-tailored suit which my mother was covertly assessing. I saw all this at a glance as I whirled into the room, flung down my portfolio, and, unpinning my bonnet, flung that down too. I had been praised by the critical Joseph Whitehead that day, and felt exhilarated. Ah, there you are, Stacy. There was satisfaction in Luella's voice, plus a kind of pleasurable anticipation which I was now well able to interpret. Money had entered the room with this young man. The thought and the significance of it chilled me somewhat. I had no desire for him to be welcomed here just for that reason. I wanted him to be welcomed for himself. I didn't pause to analyze my reaction. I was only aware of the impact he made upon me, which was one I had never felt before, not so immediately or so pleasurably. My mother was making introductions. I heard his name and that of another, and saw that a second man was seated nearby, and that Julian was glancing at him expressively, as if to say, "Don't you know you should rise when a lady enters a room?" Obviously the second man didn't. He was older, thick-set, rather coarse-featured, and when he spoke it was with a strong northern accent. "Like mother, like daughter, eh?" he eyed me boldly. "In looks, anyway." Luella frowned slightly. "I can assure you, Mr. Crowther, that is the only way in which my daughter does resemble me." "She'd do well to have your generous nature, ma'am." It might not have been meant as a compliment. It might not. Or it might have. Luella let it pass, but not I. "I agree, Mr. Crowther. My mother is the most generous woman alive. The number of needy people whom she has helped would surprise you." He was not so thick-skinned as to miss the frosty note in my voice, but it left him unembarrassed. He went on to lounging in his chair, and Julian frowned on him even more. I wondered how it came about that two such opposites should be here together. My mother picked up the silver teapot and filled it from the matching kettle on the spirit stove beside her. Tea with honors, I thought. That meant that one or the other of these men was important, or both. I feared it was the uncouth man who loudly proclaimed that Michelle was referring to so distastefully as brass. And yet it was Julian Kershaw who had the cultured air, and he obviously whom my mother wanted me to meet. That meant she was accepting Crowther on sufferance or because she had to. Otherwise she would have got rid of him before I returned. As it was, she was pouring tea for me, patting the sofa beside her, urging me to talk about what I had done today, although she had long ago ceased to be interested in my painting. "My daughter is very talented," she declared with maternal pride, addressing the remark especially to Julian. "And in that, I can assure you, she does not take after her mother." The man named Crowther said dryly, "A pity, if I may say so, ma'am. I'm sure you have great talents, Mrs. Rochdale. Leastways, so I've heard." I think it was the slow anger in Julia's eyes that endeared him to me. I knew that but for our presence he would have taken his companion to task for being insulting. My mother caught his smoldering glance and smiled serenely. "Alas, Mr. Crowther, the only talent I have is at cards, as you may find out this evening." "No woman has ever beaten me at cards, ma'am, and few men." "I can believe it." Her tone was honey, and her glance full of flattery. "But you are not going to refuse me the chance to try, I hope." He smiled indulgently. "I shall be honored, ma'am." "And I," said Julian. "Nay, lad, if you've any sense you'd keep out of the game. You know you always lose." There was a note of contempt in the older man's voice, but Julian flashed a good-natured smile. "Win or lose, what does it matter? It's only a game." "That shows how little sense thou has, lad." I felt a sharp concern. I didn't want this charming young man to become enmeshed in gambling. He caught my eye, and for a moment our glances held. I saw reassurance in his, as if he were saying, "Don't worry, I can take care of myself." I hoped so indeed. But I had no trust in his companion, whom I judged to have a head on his shoulders, a scheming brain, and a certain ruthlessness. In a broad, flat accent he asked, "And your daughter, ma'am, will she join us this evening?" "No," Luella's voice was firm. "Eustacia does not play cards." "She is wise, ma'am, or you are." The shrewd eyes looked from one to the other of us, and slowly a kind of dawning comprehension crept into them, his glance finally settling on my mother for a long and thoughtful moment. But Julian looked frankly disappointed, and before they left he said to me quietly, "I hope that when we return tonight, Miss Rochdale, I shall at least have the pleasure of seeing you, even if you don't join the game." I felt a swift elation coupled with an unaccountable shyness. My upbringing had taught me to mix with all sorts of people, so I never suffered from self-consciousness. But now I was strangely tongue-tied, keenly aware of both myself and of him. The admiration and desire in his blue eyes disturbed me. The gentle smile of his beautifully shaped mouth disturbed me. Everything about him disturbed me in a way that was both potent and important. I knew as well as he that we had to see each other again, and that we would seize each every opportunity to do so. After the two men had gone, my mother was vibrant with excitement, calling imperatively to Bella to bring out the best wines tonight and plenty of food. "That man Crowther has a healthy northern appetite, I'll be bound. And as for you, Stacy, my love, wear the sapphire velvet gown Michelle made for you. Blue is your color, particularly that shade. And see that she dresses your hair in that new style, coiled loosely on top of the head and puffed out at the sides. It makes your face look more heart-shaped than ever." So she had noticed Julian Kershaw's admiration. This proof that I had not imagined it pleased me. As I turned to go upstairs, Luella called softly, "He liked you, my darling." I looked back with a little smile. "And that pleases you?" "Very much." "Which means he is acceptable?" "More than acceptable." "Don't be too hopeful," I begged. "It might not last." "But you wanted to?" I nodded, aware of the betraying color in my cheeks and an excitement equal to her own. But the thought of her disappointment, if nothing came of this meeting, distressed me. So did the thought of his losing money at her hands and never coming back. "Please, don't let him lose tonight." "Rest assured that I shall not." Her hand came out and touched mine. "Trust me, Stacy, I know what I am about. He will return, I promise, and not merely for the thrill of the game." I asked slowly, "Is he a gambler?" She shrugged. "Most men are. I would be happier if he were not." "Then it is up to you to wean him away from it, and judging by the way he reacted to you, you should be able to do that easily enough. He is ready to be swayed by you." "They seem ill-matched companions, he and that man." "No two could be more different." "Then how did they come here together?" "Crowther came with an introduction from an old client of Danvers. You may remember him. He used to come here a lot when you were a child. Unfortunately, his wife found out and put a stop to it. Now I hear he only has an occasional flutter at his club, poor dear. It is an exclusive club, or was until it opened its doors to rich industrialists and merchants. It was there that Crowther met him. And I suppose it was there that he met Julian Kershaw, for I cannot imagine them meeting socially. Kershaw is the son of Sir Vivian Kershaw. They are a well-known Sussex family. Crowther is a mill owner from Lancashire. In every way they are poles apart, but I am glad Crowther brought Julian with him." For once I was in entire agreement with my mother. The only thing that mattered was that Julian had come into my life. "Didn't you once tell me you came from Sussex?" I asked. Luella nodded. "From the same area as Julian?" She answered indifferently. "I don't actually know where his home was. Sussex is a vast county, spreading all the way from Kent to Hampshire." "Tell me about him," Michelle demanded as she dressed my hair. "He must have made an impact on you, this young man. I have never known you so anxious to look your best." How could I describe him? Tall, handsome, blue-eyed, with a devastating charm. Sounded too much like a prince in a fairy story. And there was nothing so insubstantial about Julian. He was a man who made me aware of his masculinity and of my own femininity. He was intensely physical and made me conscious that I was too. The strength of this physical appeal frightened me a little, but it also excited me. I remembered my mother lying nude before her lover, and my cheeks flamed. For now I knew what desire was like, and that I longed to be with Julian in such a way. But not illicitly. Not as a mistress to be visited secretly like something of which to be ashamed. Michelle's knowing eyes were upon me, and to cover my confusion I glanced at the small gold watch pinned at my breast, and urged her to hurry. 7:30, Luella said, and it's almost that now. You must not be ready and waiting, Shetty. That would appear over-eager and deprive you of making an entrance. She put the finishing touches to my hair unhurriedly. And unpin that fob watch. It ruins the effect. You need no ornaments with that gown. Just your white skin to contrast with the deep blue. There. She stood back and appraised her handiwork. The style suits you, but it is becoming commonplace these days. You need something more striking, more unusual. Hairpins flew as her fingers pulled them out, and at my cry of impatience she merely said, "Do you or do you not want to win this young man? Pray, do not trouble to answer. I know it already. It is in your face, and I am happy and hopeful for you. So have a little patience, chérie, and I will do my best to make your dreams come true." "No premonitions?" I said with a laugh. "No secret warnings that things may go wrong?" "How can I experience such things without seeing him?" "That is easily rectified. Peep over the banister tonight." "Oh, I have every intention of doing so," she answered blandly as she swept my hair from my brow, twisting it into a chignon low at the back of my neck. With my bare shoulders the effect was striking. As always, Michelle's taste was faultless, suiting the style to my dress and to my looks, ignoring the dictates of fashion. She did more than peer over the banister that evening. She opened the front door, forestalling Bella. I stood on the landing, out of sight, listening to voices from far below, the loud accents of the Lancashire man and the modulated tones of Julian. My blood raced. Even his voice could stir me. Beneath my excitement, I was aware that Michelle was not being her voluble French self, but silent and restrained, playing the superior servant, no doubt. She did that when she wanted to make the right impression, or to counteract the slovenly one Bella had often given, especially if she had been too busy in the kitchen to whisk off her soiled apron. Michelle gave tone to our establishment, and I hoped that the uncouth Crowther was suitably impressed. I was also glad, and the realization shamed me, that it was Michelle who admitted them and not dear old Bella. I wanted Julian's approval of everything. I heard Michelle show the guests upstairs to the drawing-room, then the rustle of Luella's gown as she went to greet them. In a while I would go down and join them in a glass of wine, followed by supper with perhaps one or two other guests whom my mother considered worth entertaining, and who would remain for the card party later, while I went back to the drawing-room and occupied myself for the evening. That meant I would be in Julian's company for, at the very least, 2 hours. And after? That depended on how long play lasted. Meanwhile I had to compose myself with the still wild beating of my heart, and quell the betraying color in my face. Michelle was right. To have been waiting downstairs would have appeared over-eager. Even worse, it would have meant self-betrayal, for I could not have hidden this breathless excitement or my keen awareness of him. Michelle's footsteps were returning. A moment later she stood before me. Her face was white. "Don't go down there, chérie. Don't go down there." I stared. I had never seen her look like this. Her predictions and warnings were a familiar part of our lives, scarcely heeded, affectionately indulged, but now there was a tension about her which communicated sharply. Momentarily it frightened me. Then I asked briskly, "Whatever are you talking about, Michelle?" "You and that man. He smells danger, chérie, danger." Chapter 2. I swept past her and down the stairs. She was referring to Crowther, of course, with his shrewd and calculating brain, his lack of sensitivity, his unscrupulousness. Her warning was needless. I had every intention of avoiding the man, and every confidence in my mother's ability to dispose of him should he prove troublesome. Many were the men to whom she had refused further admission. Carefulness was her watchword. I had nothing to fear. My entrance was all that could be desired. Julian rose slowly to his feet, staring at me in obvious admiration, and my happiness, because it was he who betrayed himself first, was overwhelming. I made no attempt then to hide my own pleasure, and as he stooped over my hand and kissed it, I was wildly happy. Everything happened so quickly after that. For the following week Julian came to the house every night, sometimes with Crowther, sometimes alone, making the card game the reason, but really coming to see me. This he admitted very soon. I'm not all that keen on gambling, but what a convenient excuse it makes. After an hour or two I could slip away to the drawing-room to be alone with you. I knew full well that my mother encouraged him in this, terminating any game in which he was playing as quickly as she could. It is simple, my love. A few hands for low stakes, and the others grow impatient for the high gambling to begin. I was glad about this. She was being careful not to enmesh Julian in the real business of the evening. He loses a little, and he wins a little, she assured me when I expressed the slightest anxiety. I was glad about that, too, because weaning him away from a game that was no more than a slightly unprofitable pastime was easy. He assured me that he lost no more than he could afford, and invariably won it back again. I'm not like Crowther. I don't make a business of it. You mean he's a professional gambler? I felt apprehensive, anxious that my mother should not suffer at the hands of a skilled rival. By no means. But to a man of his nature, making money in any way is an essential in his life. He would be a bad loser, whereas I don't care tuppence whether I win or lose. I come here to see you. And as you know it, I am head over ears in love with you, Stacy. As I am with you, I admitted gladly. All would have been perfection but for Michelle. She went about the house looking troubled and uneasy, but I refused to heed her. For the first few days after Julian had declared his love, I could think of nothing and no one else. Michelle with her pessimistic brooding, Crowther with his cynical, watchful amusement, Luella with her suppressed eagerness, Bella with her curiosity agog, all meant nothing to me. The days began and ended with Julian's arrival and departure, and that Luella was being true to her promise was obvious, for he rarely spent more than half his time at the card table. Only once or twice after becoming an established visitor did I have to wait overlong for him to join me, and when I did he was apologetic for keeping me waiting, and kissed me even more passionately to make up for it. It was at moments like this, when the sensual undercurrent to his nature became dominant, that the first seeds of uneasiness began to grow in my mind. He loved me, but said nothing of marriage, yet he pursued me with an ever-increasing confidence and boldness. One night, after he had left the card-room later than usual, and my desire and impatience for his company had reached such a pitch that I was unable to hide it, he pulled me full length upon the drawing-room sofa and laid his body upon mine. Somehow my voluminous skirts were pushed aside. His breast was hot on my cheek, and his mouth and hands searching. I felt them on my flesh, and desire quickened within me. But simultaneously came my fear he was about to seduce me, and because I was my mother's daughter I knew what that would lead to. A passionate love affair, and then nothing. He would be the first of many lovers, and my life would follow Luella's unhappily and unsatisfactory pattern. I didn't want it. With one swift movement I was off the couch, restoring order to my disarranged skirts, smoothing my hair, turning my back upon him as I drew my open bodice over my breasts and hid from him the tears that disillusionment brought. I heard his cry of protest, and then silence. I was trembling, and knew he was too, but for a different reason. I shook because I was hurt, angry, and disappointment. He because he was physically rejected. Frustration of that kind displeases any man, but I thought indignantly that I had a right to be displeased too. I had scarcely restored order to my appearance when the door clicked open and Luella stood there. It failed to occur to me that her entrance was timely. Her experienced glance assessed the situation at once, and although she sailed into the room quite calmly, giving Julian every chance to collect himself, he knew as well as I that she was angry. Luella, as the outraged and dignified mother, was extremely effective. "Would you like me to accompany you downstairs, Mr. Kershaw?" No, thank you. I thank you, ma'am." "Then we will say good night, Mr. Kershaw." Julian threw me one beseeching glance, and walked from the room. Not till the closing of the front door echoed through the house did I break down. Luella cradled me in her arms, rocking me as she had done when I was a child. "He will come back, my love. He will come back." I didn't believe her, nor did I want him to come back solely because he desired my body. "He will come back because he loves you, Stacy, as all your lovers have loved you. All men love women that way. But you have been cleverer than I. You were wise to resist him. It was a clever ploy." "It was no ploy," indignation choked me. "I did it because that isn't what I want." Every woman who is honest admits that she wants it. I know it is the fashion to feign distaste for physical love, but that is the fault of the well-bred gentleman, who keeps his wife as a symbol of respectability and his mistress for his delight. The men make the rules, and the hypocrisy of them is not our fault. A good woman isn't supposed to enjoy sex. But as long as a man has money, he has only to stroll in the streets or parks around midnight to have his pick of thousands of prostitutes ready and willing to give him any sexual diversion he wants. We live in an age of extremes of wealth and extremes of poverty. extremes of virtue and of vice. This is why our menfolk like to imagine that their wives have such delicacy of feeling, that submitting to their physical needs is mere submission. They want it that way, as proof of purity. If a wife enjoys the physical side of marriage, the inference is that she's on a par with the impure. Luella patted my hand approvingly. Rejecting Kershaw, my love, was the wisest thing you could have done. But I told you I didn't do it because it was wise. I love him. I want him. But I didn't want to be taken like a slut on a couch. And I didn't think when he first said he loved me that that was what he intended. I don't suppose it was. But you can't blame a man for being carried away. She finished with a brisk down-to-business air. Do you wish to be his wife? I wanted nothing more passionately and said so. Then you shall be. Now wipe your eyes, go to bed, and wait for tomorrow. Tomorrow won't bring him back, I said disconsolately. He will never come back. I have already told you that he will, but you won't be here to receive him, not at first. He must wait, grow impatient, believe you haven't forgotten him, that he has insulted you irremediably. That way he will want you more, and guilt will make him anxious to atone. It all sounded very scheming to me, but when I said so, Luella laughed. And do you think men don't scheme when they want a woman? That was different, I argued. Men should be the hunter, which is precisely what Julian Kershaw is going to be. Well, I went to bed unhappily, not really believing her. Michelle looked in to say good night and regarded me with troubled eyes. He has hurt you, she stated in an I told you so voice, which annoyed me so much that I was abrupt with her, and then, of course, sorry. By that time she had left the room, closing the door ominously behind her. For the first time I wondered if there might be something in Michelle's premonitions. It was Luella I should have heeded, not Michelle, for everything worked out as she predicted. Julian began to woo me the very next day, first with flowers, accompanied by no message. Lavish red roses which spoke for themselves. He kept away from the house for a week, and each day more red roses were delivered, until it was all I could do not to send a note round to his lodgings, begging him to come to me. Had I known his address, I am positive I would have done so, risking Luella's opposition. But it suddenly occurred to me that I had no notion of where he was staying, whether he had his own apartment in London or rooms in a hotel. In all our hours together he had talked little about himself, only about me and our love, and his need and longing for me, and how he wanted to be with me always, which is why I had always mistakenly assumed that marriage was his object, since always implied permanency. When at last a note arrived, I fell upon it eagerly. Please forgive me, Eustacia. My behavior was unpardonable, but I blame my love for you. It carried me away. I beg you to let me call. It bore an address in Grosvenor Square, and Luella acted promptly. An invitation was dispatched for a card party 2 days later, but still the chance to see me was denied him. You will stay out of sight, my mother insisted. Go upstairs to your studio and don't come down. Nothing will tantalize him more than to know you are in the house and yet unavailable to him. I was aghast. The thought of being beneath the same roof, yet barred from him, was intolerable. Besides, I felt his punishment had gone on long enough, and was not wholly fair. Julian had responded to my own impatience that night. I remembered rushing across the room to greet him and being swept into his arms. My eagerness must have seemed like an open invitation. I felt now ashamed for condemning his behavior, but when I said so, Luella pronounced firmly, "It is up to the man to exercise self-control where a young and inexperienced girl is concerned." "And yet you said that night he was not to be blamed for being carried away." "That's as may be, but Kershaw must know well enough that you are a virgin, and yet he was ready to seduce you. Penitent he should well be, but don't go falling into his arms the moment he returns. Let him wait for that until after marriage, my dear." She had wisdom for me, but not for herself, I thought, but said nothing. I dined alone with Michelle that evening, then went upstairs to the attic, which I had turned into a studio. But now painting failed to absorb me. Concentration was lacking, and several times I opened the door. straining my ears for the sound of his voice from far below. Long after midnight I went to bed, aware that the game had not yet broken up, and hoping he was lingering over it only because he might eventually be able to see me. Then something told me there was no hope of our meeting tonight, that Luella was determined to keep him in the card room, for the sole purpose of depriving him of this hope, and so frustrating him that the next time he came he would be determined to have me at all costs, and propose marriage without further delay. The thought troubled me. I didn't want his hand to be forced. I wanted him to ask me to be his wife, but to ask of his own volition. I was also afraid he might take this deliberate avoidance as a rebuff and never return. And so I lay sleepless, unhappy, tormented to such a degree that I rose and left my bedroom door open, listening for the sounds of departing guests. But not until the early hours of the morning did anyone leave. Desultorily, at first, in ones and twos, then their voices from the distant hall indistinguishable, so that I had no knowledge of the precise hour at which Julian left. When I eventually heard Luella come upstairs to her room, it took all my self-control not to rush down to her, full of reproaches. Next morning at breakfast I could feel Michelle's speculative glance upon me, and I avoided it. I ate little, anxious to be gone, in no mood for conversation. A session with Joseph Whitehead was what I needed. He made his students work, and thus my mind would be taken off Julian, and my frustrated longing for him. "You are unhappy," Michelle commented as I pushed aside my chair. "But it will pass, my little Stacy. It will pass." "Is that a prediction? If so, I prefer it to your warnings," I answered lightly. "You do not heed my warnings, but you should. I knew when Monsieur Kershaw entered this house that it could only mean one thing." "Danger?" I scoffed. "That was your prediction then. I am glad you changed your mind." "Who said I changed my mind? Not I, chérie. All I say now is that your unhappiness will pass. It is a good thing that he is gone. For this reason you are unhappy just now, but I am glad. Because with his going a terrible menace goes out of your life." I flung myself out of the room impatiently. Michelle talked a lot of nonsense at times, and this was the biggest nonsense of all. Then I realized that she must be unaware of Julia's presence in the house the night before. That surprised me, for Michelle missed little. This surprise was immediately followed by the depressing idea that perhaps she had known, which lent an ominous significance to her pronouncement that he had now gone for good. I was depressed as I prepared to leave for Whitehead's studio. What if Michelle's intuition was right? What if Julian had departed in anger the night before, because he had specifically come to see me and been firmly denied? What if my mother's tactics had been wrong after all? I was suddenly angry with myself for heeding them. I should have followed my own instincts, and I hurried downstairs to see him. Now I had lost him irretrievably. I was sure of that, and my thoughts were despairing as I pushed sketches into a portfolio, aware that Joseph would be none too pleased with what I had achieved since my last session with him. My work reflected my restlessness and my inability to concentrate. But how could I explain to a man so old that I was too deeply and too unhappily in love to care about anything else? For June, the morning was cold. From my studio window I could see London's dusty plane trees swirling in the wind. The skies were gray, the weather reflected my despondent mood, and did nothing to lighten my aching loneliness. I fastened the portfolio listlessly and dragged myself down to my room, choosing a cloak at random. It hung in folds to the ground, covering the long straight dress that I wore when working, because billowing skirts got in the way in Joseph's crowded studio. Then I tied my bonnet mechanically, tucked my portfolio under one arm beneath the cloak, and pulled on my gloves. But when I saw the note lying on my dressing table, my arms went weak, and the portfolio slid to the floor, for the handwriting was Julian's. Joy and apprehension were inextricably mixed as I seized it. Impatience to open it vied with the fear of doing so. Did it bode good or ill? Happiness or unhappiness? I hardly remember slitting the envelope, but I shall always remember my joy upon reading the message inside. "Your mother has given me permission to call upon you tomorrow morning at 11. This morning, Eustacia, for I am writing this as I leave, and the hour is now 3. Please do not refuse to see me, for I have something important to ask." There was a sound behind me. It was Luella, wearing a trailing negligee lavishly ornamented with ostrich feathers, and on top of it an old woolen shawl to keep out the morning cold. But to me she looked anything but incongruous. She looked beautiful. Her smile was radiant and her voice gentle. "You put this here?" I asked breathlessly. She nodded. "He gave it to me. You were at breakfast with Michelle when I brought it up, so I left it here and then listened for you to come. Naturally, I was not going to hand it to you in front of Michelle. She sees too much." I refused to think of what Michelle saw, and in the happiness of this moment I had forgotten it anyway. Luella was untying my cloak and casting it aside. She was taking from my wardrobe a becoming morning gown of heliotrope, and telling me to discard that serviceable brown thing, with its accompanying holland smock. As they fell about my feet, she kicked them aside disdainfully, as if kicking aside forever all traces of my old life. Which indeed she was, for I never went back to Joseph Whitehead's studio. We were in the little morning room on the first floor when Julian rang the front doorbell. Luella, now respectably clad, said, "I don't think it would be unseemly, my love, if you opened the door to him yourself." I was only vaguely aware of Michelle on her way to do so, and of her abrupt halt on the landing as I forestalled her. I sailed downstairs and opened the door, standing quite still when I saw Julian's tall figure outlined against the gray morning light. We looked at each other, not saying a word, then his steps were behind me as I remounted the stairs. The morning room was empty. Luella had left it to us. Julian closed the door and I turned to look at him. He was pale, his eyes were shadowed, and at this evidence of the distress our separation had caused him, my love overflowed, and I held out my hands in a swift and impassioned gesture. I scarcely heard his formal proposal of marriage. It seemed less than the fact that he was here, that I had not lost him, that his arms were closing about me and holding me as if he would never let me go. Later, over his shoulder, I saw the gray skies outside and thought how beautiful the day was. Most beautiful indeed. We were married quickly and quietly. Julian wanted that way, and my eagerness matched his own. Only briefly amidst the world of preparation did I question him about his family. I was anxious for their approval and afraid that a sudden marriage might antagonize them. Julian brushed it all aside. "My father has been incapacitated for a long time, the result of a stroke after Gerald, my oldest brother, died. He is confined to a wheelchair now and spends most of his life in his room at Dragonmede. That's our family estate in Sussex. Aunt Dorcas looks after him. She is his sister, and returned to Dragonmede when she was widowed, so neither of them will be able to come." "But what of your mother? Won't she be anxious to attend her son's wedding?" "My mother died when I was born, but I have a stepmother, Lady Miriam, of whom I think highly. Since my father's stroke she has rarely gone anywhere. 2 things fill her life now: Dragonmede, which she loves, and Christopher, my young half-brother, whom she loves above anything. He will soon enter Sandhurst, and I fear she is going to miss him badly. She has never been parted from him. He didn't go to Eton as Gerald and I did, but was educated by tutors at home. Miriam always maintained he was delicate, but Gerald and I thought him pampered, and I think my father did too, because shortly after he had the stroke he insisted that Christopher should have a military career. He said it would make a man of him, and so it will. He's too dreamy by half, always mooning about the place, or painting pictures, or going off for long walks alone. Are his paintings good? I haven't the faintest idea. I've never seen them, and I'm not particularly interested anyway. A man should be a man. Christopher isn't. Hates blood sports. Even the sight of a gun turns him green." Julian laughed. "No man is cut out for country life if he can't handle a gun. That's one thing Sandhurst will teach him, at least." I felt sneaking sympathy for Christopher, who disliked blood sports, and was forced to live in a world that took them for granted. I hoped I wouldn't be expected to hunt when I became a member of the Kershaw family. Riding was one thing, killing quite another. When I said this, Julian laughed again, and he kissed me. "There speaks your city upbringing, Eustacia. When you have adapted yourself to country life, you'll realize that hunting is a great sport and a necessary one. It helps to keep down the vermin fox, for which the farmers are grateful. I changed the subject because I wanted nothing, not even a differing point of view, to cause dissension between us. I inquired about the rest of the family. Had he no other relatives whom he'd like to see at our wedding? None. I've a cousin, Nicholas Bly, Aunt Dorcas's son, but I don't see much of him. He visits Dragonmede to see his mother, but of course he isn't really a Kershaw, stemming from the distaff side. And he takes very much after his father. Poor Dorcas blotted the family escutcheon when she married Matthew Bly. Why? What was wrong with him? Only that he was the village doctor, and so not of any special standing. I felt a stab of apprehension. Then what will they think of me, for I had no social standing at all? Julian answered lightly that they would adore me as he did. You're young and beautiful and healthy, and that's all you need to be. And remember that Dorcas was of an earlier generation, whose standards were different from ours. She was expected to make a brilliant marriage. I understand she was very good-looking when young and could have had many a man. Choosing a village doctor in the face of parental opposition was a pretty outrageous thing to do in those days. It would be easier now, since the medical profession has risen in esteem. Even Nicholas is considered acceptable by many country families. Did I imagine that note of dislike, or was it resentment? Julian finished indifferently. He became a doctor, too. Your aunt must have loved his father very much. Which made it all worthwhile, I suppose. I almost asked, as loving me makes it all worthwhile to you, but I checked the words. I could only pray that such deep-dyed social prejudice no longer prevailed in the Kershaw family. For Julian had chosen a bride who was not only penniless, but from a background so far removed from his own, that if his relatives ever learned the truth about it, his marriage would be far less acceptable than his aunt's had ever been. My apprehension deepened, but I thrust it aside, concentrating on the thought of how deeply Julian must love me. It was I who was gaining everything from this marriage, he who was gaining nothing. And yet he had set his heart upon me, rushing the wedding because he was so impatient to make me his wife, and ready to take me back to Dragonmede proudly and happily. I considered myself the most fortunate young woman in the world. Only one small thing marred my wedding day, the presence of the man Crowther. Since the ceremony was so quiet and the guests so few, I failed to understand why he was invited. But Luella merely shrugged when I protested. Why not, my love? He is uncouth, I grant you, but he is rich and has given you a lavish wedding present. And remember, but for him you would never have met Julian. This was true, so I made no further protest, nor did I allow myself to speculate upon the friendship between my mother and Crowther. That it was no more than a friendship I was well aware. It was a long time since Luella had taken a lover, and if anything of that nature had been impending between them, I would have known. The signs were familiar to me. In a way, the mere fact that no sexuality was involved made their friendship even more significant. Its roots were buried deeper in some obscure earth. Because I had no father to give me away, Joseph Whitehead did so. His celebrated name brought the event to the attention of the London Gazette, and because the bridegroom was heir to a baronetcy, my wedding created quite a stir. I had a strong suspicion that Luella had made sure the Gazette was informed, and an even stronger and more unhappy one that Julian was not particularly pleased about it. I wanted to plead with him in her behalf, to point out that a proud mother should be given on such an occasion as this. But there were moments when, despite the depth of feeling between us, Julian could become unapproachable. It was as if a barricade went up, and at such moments he became a stranger to me, chill, aloof, making me very much aware that he was marrying outside his social sphere. I refused to think of it as marrying beneath him, for not only had he brushed that aside, but I felt in no way inferior to him. My finishing at Bedlington, my association with girls from noble families, my visits to their homes, my acceptance as one of them, All this had equipped me for marriage to Julian Kershaw. So I attributed these moments to nothing but moodiness, since they were always passed quickly. I just refused to worry about them. The parish church was surprisingly full, most of Bloomsbury's artistic and bohemian quarter flocking in to watch. Many of them, like myself, had rarely been inside a church. Luella had turned her back on religion when she ran away from the parsonage, and I was therefore surprised when she insisted on church ceremony, and not a civil one. I was glad of this, for to me my marriage was a sacred thing, the dedication of myself and my life to one man. I wanted it to be blessed. Julian said there had never been so beautiful a bride. Everyone else said the same. But to me it was Luella who looked magnificent. Happiness revitalized her. I alone knew how passionately she had yearned for me to marry well, and now I was doing so. I was justifying all the expense of Bedlington Grange, and all her determination that I should be equipped for a better life than her own. Her obsessive desire that her daughter should achieve the accolade of respectability, with such a marriage as this inevitably brought, was now most wonderfully fulfilled. No wonder she looked radiant, almost triumphant. My heart warmed when I looked at her, but not when I looked at Michelle. As I returned up the aisle on my husband's arm, I caught sight of her face, white, tense, and distraught. I had seen that look once before when she had come hurrying upstairs and pleaded, "Don't go down there, Shetty, don't go down there." Hard on that echo I heard another, "He spells danger, Shetty, danger." For a stabbing moment, fear touched me, thrusting upward through the serenity and peace of the church, putting a cold finger upon my happiness. And then I saw Crowther, looking on with a sardonic smile, as if secretly and maliciously amused. There was time for only a 1 week's honeymoon before Julian had to return to Dragonmede. Since his father's illness he had taken over responsibility for the estate, and therefore could not be away for too long, even though he had an able young steward to help him. Already he had overstayed his holiday in London, extending it from a month to 6 weeks because of our marriage. It seemed incredible that we had known each other for so short a time. He had become the most important part of my life so swiftly that it was hard to recall what it had been like without him. I suppose the way in which we spent our honeymoon was unusual, but to us it was the only way, the perfect way. No honeymoon hotel, no bridal suite, no journey abroad, no visit to the south coast or to a country beauty spot. Julian took me back to the apartment he was occupying in Grosvenor Square, and there we shut the door upon the world, waited upon by a discreet manservant whom, Julian told me, he had rented with the place. A man who came and went daily, attending to our needs when required and disappearing when not. Alone in this private world, Julian initiated me into the delights of love, and my body changed from that of a girl into a woman. He was tender and then increasingly passionate lover, and my response was unstinting. With his head resting upon my bare shoulder and his body at peace, he said one day, "Thank God you're not one of those frigid women that men seem to expect their wives to be nowadays. A symbol of sanctity and unappetizing virtue." It was impossible for me even to pretend to be. I had all my mother's passionate nature, but in one respect I was different. I could never have given myself so freely to more than one man, and the fact that this man was my husband made it all the more lovely and more right. The bonds of matrimony were bonds I welcomed, and now I pitied Luella because she had never married again. That was the root of her unhappiness, her restlessness, and her promiscuity. She had met no man capable of replacing my father. The thought of losing Julian terrified me, for surely no man would ever be able to replace him either. I clung to him then, remembering the tragedies in his family to which he referred to not lightly, but with a kind of acceptance and inevitability. The death of his mother in childbirth, his father's stroke, the loss of his eldest brother. "What is it, Eustacia? You seem frightened." I admitted that I was. "Why, my love? Did you have a bad dream? I thought you were sleeping peacefully. You always do, after I have loved you." I did, and I had no dream. But suddenly I had to tell him, "I am afraid of losing you." His hand caressed me. "Is it likely?" What put such a thought into your head?" "I was thinking of your brother Gerald. From the way you talked of him, he sounded alive and vigorous." "So he was." "Then how did he die?" "He was drowned in the lake at Dragonmede." I shuddered, and he drew my body closer to his. "Don't think about it, my sweet." "But how did it happen?" "Nobody really knows. He was found floating in the lake, his dinghy also upturned. There's a small island in the middle of the lake with an Italian arbor on it. My grandfather had a passion for landscape gardening, and designed the lake and the arbor. We used it to row across to it when we were children, and have the greatest games. It isn't a big lake, and it's sheltered from winds." "And yet Gerald's boat capsized?" "Yes, the verdict was accidental death, of course." His voice shook a little, which told me that, despite his attitude of calm acceptance, he still grieved for his brother. I resolved then never to refer to Gerald's death again. And at that I will close it for this week. I thank you for watching. If you appreciate this, please hit like, send a message, send an email, whatever you prefer. I'll see you again next week at 2.